Why was it that the first time she picked up a rifle, the noise in her head finally went quiet? Frances Jones remembered that day with painful clarity. A damp Manchester morning, the smell of rain still clinging to the shooting range, and her grandfather's calloused hand guiding her toward the trigger. She had been 14, shaken from another brutal week of schoolyard cruelty, too small, too shy, too different. The bullies never let her forget it. But when her cheek pressed against the cold rifle stock, something shifted. The chaos inside her, the doubt, the fear, the constant ache of not belonging dissolved. The world narrowed to a single point, a black circle on a white target board waiting for her. The first shot broke like thunder, the recoil bit into her shoulder, but her bullet, it was clean, center. Her grandfather chuckled, that gravelly laugh of a man who'd flown fighters in a different war. "There you are, Francis," he said. "The world's quiet now, isn't it?" It was, for the first time in years. She chased that silence every chance she got. 6 months later, she was outperforming men twice her age, seasoned shooters who'd spent decades on the range. By 16, she was beating regional champions. By 18, she was untouchable. Trophies lined her bedroom wall, but they meant less than the peace she found in the steady rhythm of breath, scope, trigger. So when the military came calling, it felt inevitable. Recruiters saw numbers they couldn't ignore. Precision scores 15% higher than anyone in her age group. A calmness under pressure that baffled instructors. She was promised the fast track to Britain's elite marksman program, the Royal Logistics Corps. A chance to serve her country and carry the weapon she had come to see not as metal and glass, but as a part of herself. She believed them. Base in Yorkshire was supposed to be the dream. Nestled among windswept hills, its ranges stretched across rolling valleys where distances blurred into the horizon. Targets set at 800 meters, 1,200, 2,000. A place where mathematics met instinct, where veterans, men from Afghanistan, Iraq, unnamed shadows of classified operations, trained the next generation of snipers. It was here she thought her life's work would finally mean something. But from the first day, Captain James made sure she understood that for him, she would never belong. He was 43, broad as a rugby forward, his jaw set with the permanence of authority. To others, he was brilliance wrapped in discipline, demanding but fair. A commander whose standards were steel and whose word was law. That was the reputation. To her, he was something else. A man whose eyes lingered just a moment too long, whose lips curled in that half-smile whenever she carried the .50. A man who saw her not as a soldier, but as an inconvenience. "This isn't a game for little girls playing dress-up," he'd announced on her first morning, voice carrying across the orientation room. The other recruits laughed nervously, waiting for his cue. Real warfare requires strength, endurance, and fortitude that no amount of emotions can teach. Her cheeks burned, but she said nothing. Silence had always been her shield. Yet silence didn't protect her when the sabotage began. The first rifle she was assigned rattled oddly when she fired. A defect, she thought, until she realized the screws had been deliberately loosened. Ammunition issued to her ran inconsistent loads, throwing off patterns just enough to make her grouping look sloppy. Even her shooting positions, the rocky, unstable posts assigned during training drills, were subtly chosen to trip her balance, to make her appear unsteady. And every time she faltered was there, arms crossed, smug, recording her failures with the sharp scratch of pen against clipboard. "This is why," he'd say to the others, "standards exist." She endured it day after day, for 3 years, 1,000 small humiliations, each one a cut that should have bled her resolve dry. She stayed anyway, because every time he pushed harder, every time he tried to shatter her spirit, she thought of her grandfather's words, "Make the weapon adapt to you." And then came the demonstration. The annual test of excellence, the most prestigious event on base. Visiting generals, NATO observers, defense contractors, all gathered to watch the 12 best shooters prove themselves on its long-range course. Careers were made in that arena. A perfect performance could mean selection for the SAS, or quiet recruitment into units so classified they didn't officially exist. She had earned her slot with scores that left no room for doubt. 8 months of consistency, superior numbers, perfect records, even couldn't exclude her without drawing suspicion. But inclusion was not acceptance, not for him. The morning of the event, he called her at 500, his voice smooth, almost cordial. "Jones, a change in schedule. Bring your for inspection. New safety protocols." She didn't question it. He had authority and she obeyed. She watched as he disappeared into the armory with the rifle that had become her lifeline. He returned 20 minutes later, smiling. "Everything's ready, perfectly calibrated." She should have known. 3 hours later, walking to the firing line with dignitaries watching from the observation deck, she lifted the into her arms and felt it immediately. Wrong. The balance off. The scope blurred at edges that had always been crystalline. The cheek rest shifted unnaturally against her jaw. A sick certainty clenched in her stomach. He had sabotaged her weapon, again. But this time, it wasn't just training exercises or whispered doubts among recruits. This was her career, her name, her chance. And he was betting everything that in front of the most powerful military audience in Europe, she would fail. 800 meters, the first target. Easy in theory, bread and butter shot. She steadied, breath squeezed. The shot went wide by 18 inches. A miss so clear the murmurs on the observation deck were audible. His voice cut the air, mock concern. "Steady on, Jones, pressure's a heavy thing." Her heart sank. 900 meters, miss again, even wider, her hands trembled. The generals whispered. The defense contractors scribbled notes. This was supposed to be her proving ground. Instead, it was becoming the coffin had built for her. She closed her eyes for a moment, forcing herself to breathe. And in the silence, she heard her grandfather again. "Adapt, Francis. Don't fight the weapon. Make it yours." The words clung to her, a lifeline. Somewhere deep inside, a decision hardened. She would not give him this victory. What if she simply walked away? The thought whispered in her head as the second miss echoed across the valley. Her pulse hammered against her ribs. Every pair of eyes on that observation deck was watching her, recording her, judging her. A young woman, 24, already drowning under the weight of expectations she had never asked for. She could walk away now, save herself the humiliation of more misses, claim equipment malfunction, and retreat into the anonymity of failure. But something inside her refused. She had endured 3 years of sabotage, 3 years of whispered doubts, 3 years of "you don't belong." And in those years she had learned one thing: failure in silence only feeds the liar. The third target loomed, 1,000 meters out. She steadied, adjusted, fired. Miss. The snickers rippled from the lower ranks watching at the edges of the field. Smirk widened, his arms folded across his chest. He looked like a man already drafting the narrative in his head. She cracked under pressure. Not tough enough. Not built for this. But as Frances lowered her cheek to the cheek rest again, something shifted. Her grandfather's voice. The old man's steady hand on hers, years ago. "A great marksman doesn't fight the weapon, Frances. A great marksman makes it bend to them." She exhaled slowly, recalibrating not the rifle but her own mind. This was no longer her, not the familiar weapon she had trained with for 8 months. This was a stranger, and strangers, if you studied them carefully enough, revealed their patterns. She began to watch the scope differently. The misaligned reticle wasn't an enemy, it was information. If it was off by this much at 800 meters, then at 1,200 meters it would be off by more. Predictable. She could map the sabotage in her mind like a set of equations. The loosened bipod wasn't a trap, it was leverage. If she applied pressure just so, she could stabilize against the instability. Her heartbeat slowed, her breathing steadied. She wasn't fighting's weapon anymore, she was making it hers. Target 5, 1,200 meters. The wind tugged faintly across the valley. She calculated the scope's distortion, her breathing a metronome, finger on trigger, squeeze. The crack echoed. The shot struck close, not perfect but within the target ring. Gasps from the observation deck. Smirk faltered. Target 6, 1,400 meters, moving pattern. She tracked it, counted the rhythm, compensated for the misaligned optics. Breath, trigger. Direct hit. The murmurs shifted. Surprise replaced pity. Target 7, 1,600 meters, dead center. She could almost feel his jaw tightening. By the time she settled on target 8, 1,900 meters out, her body was no longer trembling. The valley stretched before her like a map she had memorized. She read the wind as if it were sheet music. She saw the scope's error as if it were a second set of eyes guiding her. The shot cracked, steel rang, perfect strike. Applause broke out on the observation deck. Genuine, not polite, not hesitant, genuine. And his face drained of color. He had stacked the deck. He had set the trap. And now, before 3 brigadier generals, NATO officials, and the entire command, his scheme was unraveling. But was not a man to watch quietly as his plan collapsed. Target 9, the moving plate at 2,100 meters, required not just precision but timing. Split-second calculation. Francis exhaled, reading the rhythm of its swing. She was about to squeeze when his voice cut across the field. Hold fire. He strode toward her, feigning urgency, his boots pounding against the dirt. The crowd hushed. His voice carried, loud enough for all to hear. I'm detecting signs of weapon malfunction, he announced, crouching beside her with manufactured concern. Heat distortion from the barrel, unstable recoil, potential ammunition faults. For everyone's safety, I must inspect the rifle immediately. Her pulse thudded. She knew this game. If he took the now, the demonstration would end. He, declare the weapon unsafe, chalk her hits up to chance and bury her under the paperwork of disqualification. His hand moved toward her rifle. And something inside her broke. 3 years of humiliation, 3 years of sabotage, 3 years of staying silent. No more. Her left hand shot out, clamping down on his wrist, grip like steel. His eyes flickered in surprise. He tried to wrench the weapon away, leaning into his size, his strength. But he had forgotten what years of precision shooting did to a soldier's grip. Her fingers were iron. Her hands trained to hold steady through recoil, fatigue, weather, stress. With a twist of muscle memory drilled from combat training, she locked his wrist. His confident mask cracked. Shock, pain. The sound echoed sharp as a gunshot, bone-breaking. Screamed, staggered backward, clutched his mangled hand to his chest. The entire field froze. 300 people, soldiers, generals, NATO observers, defense contractors, stared in disbelief. A young corporal, 24 years old, had just broken her commanding officer's hand in full view of Europe's military elite. His face twisted between agony and rage. His voice was hoarse with pain. You've ended your career, Jones, assaulting a superior officer in front of witnesses. You'll be court-martialed, imprisoned, finished. She rose slowly, still in her hands, her body trembling but her voice clear. Permission to continue the demonstration, ma'am. The words were directed upward, to the observation deck. To Brigadier General, the one woman among the brass, known for her no-nonsense command, for fighting her own battles when women first clawed their way into combat roles. His gaze was sharp, calculating. She weighed the scene, the screams, the silence. Then she spoke. Captain, report to the medical facility, immediately. Froze, disbelief breaking across his face. Ma'am. That's in order. He staggered off, humiliated, clutching his broken hand. His eyes shifted back to Francis. Corporal Jones, continue. The words landed like thunder. The crowd erupted in whispers. The demonstration wasn't over. And Francis knew every shot she fired now would be more than a test of skill. It would be a statement. Not just to the generals, but to every soldier watching, every woman who had been told she wasn't strong enough, steady enough, worthy enough. She lowered herself back to the firing position. The still felt wrong, still sabotaged, but she no longer saw it as a weakness. It was proof of everything she had endured. Target 9 waited. She inhaled, exhaled, watched the moving plate sweep in its rhythm, squeezed. The bullet arced across the valley, dead center. The steel clanged, the applause was real. Was gone, his shadow remained, but with each shot left she would erase it. And in her heart she knew, the next bullets would not just hit targets, they would carve a truth into stone. That she belonged. What did silence feel like when 300 people held their breath at once? Frances could feel it pressing in around her as she lay prone on the line, the sabotaged resting against her shoulder. Was gone now, humiliated, staggering toward the infirmary with his hand twisted and broken. But his presence still lingered like smoke. She could feel his venom in every whisper, every sideways glance from the crowd. She steadied her breathing. The rifle was still wrong, the scope distorted, the balance skewed, the bipod unreliable. But her grip on it had changed. It was no longer a weapon, no longer the instrument of her sabotage. It was hers again, claimed through pain and fury. Target 9 swung in the distance, 2,100 meters away. Moving in erratic arcs, a mechanical system designed to mimic a human opponent sprinting across a battlefield. The kind of shot that required instinct as much as calculation. She tracked its rhythm, watched the way it hesitated at each turn, calculated lead, wind, drift, scope, distortion. The math spun in her head like a dance she had learned by heart. She exhaled. The rifle cracked. The bullet streaked invisible through the valley. The steel plate jerked violently as the round hit dead center. The target froze, disabled. The sound carried across the range, metal against metal, then a beat of stunned silence, then applause, unrestrained, genuine. She didn't smile. Not yet, this wasn't done. Target 10, 2,200 meters, hidden behind a wall of steel obstacles that created unpredictable wind tunnels. The kind of target that broke seasoned snipers, twisting their calculations into failure. But she knew this field. She had walked it, studied the currents, felt the subtle changes in air pressure across the valley. She exhaled, imagined the wind as water curling through rocks, flowing, redirecting. She adjusted the sabotage scope, felt the misalignment like a weight in her mind, and compensated. Trigger squeeze, shot released. The bullet cut through the air, arced and smacked into steel. Another perfect strike. The whispers from the deck grew louder. Defense contractors scribbled frantically. Generals leaned forward. Even the hardened NATO observers, men and women who had watched snipers across continents, were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Frances ignored them. The world had shrunk again just as it had when she was 14. Her, the rifle, and the target. Target 11, the hardest yet, 2,400 meters. A dinner plate-sized circle bolted to a steel post, barely visible through the shimmering heat haze. Most shooters prayed just to graze it. Few had ever hit it dead on. She closed her eyes for a moment, heard the wind, felt the valley breathing around her, remembered her grandfather's words, "The world's quiet now, isn't it?" When she opened them, her heartbeat was steady. She squeezed. Time stretched. The bullet flew, a long arc of inevitability. Then the plate shuddered violently, the shot striking perfect center. The applause this time was thunder. The observers didn't just clap, they stood. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others exchanged glances that carried the weight of political consequence. But Frances wasn't finished. The 12th target waited, the impossible one. 2,500 meters, a mile and a half. A head-sized steel circle swaying slightly on its post. It was the kind of shot legends were made of, the kind whispered about in sniper folklore. And now, every person present knew, If she made this shot, there would be no denying her. Not anyone. She adjusted her position, felt her heartbeat slow. The sabotaged scope distorted the image, but she had come to expect that. She measured the wind by the shimmer of heat rising off the valley floor, by the faint quiver of grass in the distance. Every variable mapped itself in her mind. Bullet drop, air pressure, the Earth's rotation tugging on trajectory. The math settled, so did she. The trigger broke. The bullet flew, a long, impossible flight. She watched it all the way, watched the shimmer, the arc, the inevitable descent. Then it struck. Perfect center. The valley erupted. Applause, shouts, the crack of hands against hands echoing through the hills. NATO officials stood to their feet. Generals clapped with grim smiles. Defense contractors shouted to one another, already imagining reports and contracts. But none of it mattered to Frances. She lay there, cheeks still pressed to the stock, the echo of the recoil humming in her bones. For 3 years had told her she wasn't good enough. For 3 years he had sabotaged, humiliated, undermined. And in one impossible moment, she had answered him without a single word. Her hands shook now, but not from fear, from release, from the weight of 3 years sliding off her shoulders. When she rose, the in her hands, Brigadier General was already descending from the observation deck. Pale and trembling with rage and pain, tried to intercept her with his uninjured hand raised, his mouth forming protests. But didn't stop for him. She walked straight to Frances. "Corporal Jones," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent range. "That was the most impressive demonstration of adaptive marksmanship I've seen in 30 years of service. Your ability to overcome sabotage and still deliver precision under pressure." She paused, met Frances's eyes. "Suggests capabilities our most elite units could use." The words landed heavy, final. His face went ashen. He knew what those words meant. Recommendation. Special operations evaluation. The kind of opportunity soldiers dreamed about their entire careers. And she had earned it in one morning, earned it by enduring his sabotage, his cruelty, his systematic attempts to destroy her. Turned toward the observers. "This demonstration is concluded." But Frances knew this was only the beginning. Because what had done wasn't just about her. It was about every woman he had sabotaged, every career he had quietly buried, every soldier silenced under his authority. And now, in front of Europe's military elite, his entire empire of control had cracked. The investigation would follow, the questions would come, and Frances would no longer stay silent. What happens when silence follows thunder? That was the question hanging in the air after Frances lowered her for the final time. The applause had died down. Generals gathered their papers. NATO observers spoke in low, urgent voices. Defense contractors scribbled furiously as if recording history itself. But beneath all of that, a strange quiet had settled over the rain. Frances could feel it, the hush of recognition, the weight of something larger than her perfect shots. She had not just fired at steel. She had fired into the heart of an institution. She stood alone on the line, rifle in hand, as the crowd dispersed. Her pulse was still racing, her palms damp, her body vibrating with the aftershock of defiance. Had disappeared into the infirmary, his broken hand pressed to his chest, but his absence felt louder than his presence ever had. General was the last to leave the observation deck. She descended with calm, measured steps, her gaze never leaving Frances. When she finally reached her, she didn't smile. She didn't even nod. She simply said, "Report to my office after debrief. This isn't over." It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. That night Frances couldn't sleep. Her body ached from the strain, but it wasn't fatigue that kept her awake. It was the memory of Smirk, the humiliation she had endured, the long years of silence. And now, the terrifying possibility that speaking truth would either save her career or end it. She lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling of the barracks. Other soldiers slept soundly, their breathing steady in the dark. But her mind replayed every detail. The misaligned scope, the loose bipod, the cheek rest adjusted just high enough to strain her neck. Hadn't simply wanted her to fail. He had wanted her broken. And if she hadn't adapted, if she had accepted those misses as proof of her incompetence, he would have buried her. The next morning she stood outside's office. Her uniform pressed, her rifle surrendered to the armory for inspection. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear of, but from the knowledge that truth was dangerous. Inside, the general was waiting, papers spread across her desk, a steaming cup of tea untouched at her side. She gestured for Francis to sit. "Corporal Jones," began, her voice level, "yesterday you did more than hit targets. You exposed something." Francis swallowed. "Ma'am." Raised a hand. "I'm not asking for your defense. I saw enough with my own eyes, but what concerns me is this. Rifles do not sabotage themselves. Bipods do not weaken by accident. Scopes do not in precisely the way yours did. What happened yesterday was not coincidence. It was deliberate." The words struck Frances harder than any reprimand. For 3 years she had endured in silence, convincing herself that no one would believe her. Now, for the first time, a superior officer wasn't dismissing her. She was nomming the truth aloud. "Ma'am," Frances said carefully, her voice steady despite the storm inside her, "I believe Captain deliberately altered my rifle before the demonstration." Studied her face, searching for hesitation, for exaggeration. She found none. "I thought as much," the general said finally. "Which is why, effective immediately, I've ordered a full technical examination of your weapon. Our engineers will confirm whether unauthorized modifications were made. Until then, you are to document everything. Every faulty piece of equipment, every incident of sabotage, every word has said to you in training. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." Francis's chest tightened. Relief, terror, both tangled together. That evening, investigators swarmed the armory. Military engineers in coveralls dismantled her piece by piece, their gloved hands moving with surgical precision. Frances stood behind the observation glass, her heart in her throat. Every screw, every scope adjustment, every hairline mark was examined. Hours passed. Finally, the lead engineer turned toward the glass, his expression grave. He gestured for Francis to join him inside. On the table lay the disassembled, its parts arranged like organs from a dissected body. The engineer's voice was clinical, but the weight of his words was anything but. "This rifle was deliberately sabotaged," he said. "The scope was misaligned using specialized tools. The bipod mounts were weakened through stress techniques designed to fail under pressure. Most concerning, the barrel itself shows signs of tampering that could have led to catastrophic malfunction during extended fire. If Corporal Jones had continued with rapid shots, the weapon could have exploded in her hands." Frances felt her stomach drop. Hadn't just wanted her embarrassed, he had risked her life. His jaw tightened. "Document everything, chain of custody, full report to my office by morning." The engineer nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Dismissed the team, then turned to Francis. For the first time, the general's eyes softened. "You understand what this means, don't you?" Francis nodded slowly. "That it wasn't just me." Leaned back against the table. "Exactly. If did this to you, it's unlikely you were his first target. Others may have suffered similar sabotage, but without the chance you had yesterday to expose it." The words felt like a blade twisting in Frances's chest. She thought of Sarah Mitchell, the communications specialist whose radios always seemed to fail at the worst moments. Of Lieutenant, passed over for promotion despite scores that outpaced her peers. Of the quiet looks exchanged in the barracks between women who never spoke aloud what they suspected. How many careers had buried? Within 48 hours convened a formal inquiry. Witnesses were called. Soldiers whispered nervously, unsure if telling the truth would save them or ruin them. At first the men closed ranks, hesitant to admit they had seen anything. But then Sarah Mitchell stepped forward, documents in hand, logs of faulty equipment issued by his office, records that didn't match official supply lists. Then spoke, her voice trembling but clear, describing years of deliberate exclusion from training rotations, her requests always lost or delayed. And finally, the most unexpected voice, Sergeant Major Robert Clark, a veteran, a man respected by everyone. He admitted what others hadn't dared, that he had seen tamper with equipment, that he had heard the mocking words behind closed doors, that he had stayed silent because silence felt safer. "I failed them," Clark said quietly in the inquiry room. "Every woman who came through that unit. I let fear of authority outweigh my duty to protect soldiers. That ends today." The words cracked something open. One by one, others followed. Accounts of accidents that suddenly weren't accidents anymore. Reports of women transferred, demoted, humiliated, all under his command. The inquiry spread like fire. What began as a single rifle sabotage widened into a web of misconduct that reached beyond. Names surfaced. Other bases, other officers, wasn't alone. For Frances, it was both vindication and horror. Vindication that she hadn't been imagining it. Horror at how far the rot had spread. Late one night, sitting alone on her bunk, she wrote in her journal, "It was never about me. It was about all of us. He tried to bury us in silence. But silence ends the moment one voice refuses to stay quiet." She closed the notebook, her hands trembling. Outside, the wind swept across the Yorkshire hills, carrying with it the echo of gunfire from training ranges. For the first time, she wondered if those echoes might finally mean change. But in the shadows of the barracks, she also knew this truth wasn't finished. Men like him never went down quietly. What does a man do when the walls finally close in? Captain James did not vanish into quiet disgrace after the demonstration. He limped away with a broken hand and a shattered. But men like him, men who built their power on fear and silence, rarely surrendered without a fight. The investigation into the sabotage spread like fire through dry grass. Military engineers had confirmed deliberate tampering, their reports clinical and damning. Soldiers whispered in the barracks, each new testimony stitching together a pattern no one could ignore. Files surfaced. Logs of equipment quietly altered. Records of evaluations mysteriously downgraded. But had not spent 20 years in uniform without preparing for moments like this. He had a plan. In the weeks following the demonstration, investigators unearthed what he called his containment protocols. Folders filled with character profiles of every woman who had passed through his unit, notes on vulnerabilities, personal histories, even family issues. Frances's file was the thickest. He had tracked her since her first day, her age, her background, the rumors whispered behind her back. He had been building a case for years, one designed to destroy her if she ever spoke out. To his allies, he painted himself as a victim, a man punished not for sabotage, but for upholding true standards. He argued that the military had become a social experiment, one that endangered lives by lowering the bar for women. To sympathetic ears, those who feared change, his words still carried weight. "Jones is unstable," he wrote in one report circulated among friendly officers. "Prone to emotional volatility, aggressive tendencies, likely to crack under combat pressure. Yesterday was not proof of skill, it was luck wrapped in arrogance." Frances heard whispers of those words as she walked the halls. She saw the way some men glanced at her now, half in awe, half in suspicion. His poison still lingered. And yet she could feel the tide turning. General was relentless. She widened the inquiry, pulling records from other bases. Similar patterns emerged. Other women stepped forward, trembling but resolute. Each story carried the same fingerprints: faulty gear, public humiliation, careers derailed by subtle sabotage. The web was bigger than anyone imagined, was not a lone wolf. He was a node in a network. But still he fought. His broken hand healed in a cast, his swagger replaced with a brittle defiance. He hired lawyers. He leaned on old allies. He whispered to contractors who had paid him for years to prove integration was dangerous. If he fell, they would fall too. Money and power do not surrender easily. And through it all, Frances remained silent in public. She carried on with her duties, went to the range, drilled with the same precision she always had. But at night, in the privacy of her bunk, her thoughts raged. Could she survive this? The investigation had already marked her. She was no longer invisible. Her name was whispered in headquarters, printed in reports, stamped on classified memos. She had become both a symbol and a target. Some nights she lay awake with her heart pounding, imagining's eyes on her even now, plotting his next move. Other nights she thought of her grandfather, of that first quiet shot at 14, and found resolve in the memory. Then the summons came. She was ordered to testify at the preliminary hearing that would decide whether faced a full court-martial. The weight of that order nearly crushed her. Testify, speak aloud the things she had endured for 3 years, speak against a captain, speak against the system that had sheltered him. What if they didn't believe her? What if they believed him? The night before the hearing, she sat alone in the chapel on base. The small stone building smelled of wax and wood polish, its stained glass windows glowing faintly in the moonlight. She wasn't religious, but she needed the quiet. She needed to sit somewhere her voice couldn't follow. Her hands shook as she wrote in her journal. I never wanted to be a symbol, I just wanted to shoot, to find silence, to belong, but maybe this isn't about me anymore. Maybe it's about every voice he silenced, every soldier he tried to break. If I stay quiet, then I'm no better than the silence that protected him. If I speak, I risk everything. But maybe silence was never safety at all. She closed the notebook and let the stillness settle over her. Her chest rose and fell. She imagined her grandfather's hand again, steady on hers. Make it adapt to you, Frances. The next morning the hearing room was packed. Officers lined the benches. Journalists hovered outside, their pens poised. Sat at the defendant's table, uniform stiff, his casted hand resting like an accusation. His eyes found hers as she entered, cold and sharp. Corporal Jones, the presiding officer called, "Take the stand." Her legs trembled as she walked forward. Every step felt heavier. Every heartbeat echoed in her ears. She swore she could hear his breath, the faint smirk tugging at his mouth as if daring her to falter. She sat, the oath was read. She raised her hand and spoke the words, her voice steady despite the storm. Do you swear to tell the truth? I do. And then the questions began. What happened that morning? How did the rifle feel? What adjustments had been made? She answered each one carefully, clearly. Her voice shook at first but grew steadier with every word. She described the blurred reticle, the loosened bipod, the unnatural cheek rest. She described her misses, her panic, and the moment she remembered her grandfather's lesson. She described adapting to sabotage and hitting targets never expected her to hit. And then she described the moment he tried to seize her rifle. The room went still as she spoke. Her words cut through the silence like the crack of a shot. His face twitched, his jaw tightening. When her account ended, the prosecution rested. Thence lawyer rose. Corporal Jones, he said smoothly, isn't it true that you have a history of emotional struggles? That you were bullied as a child, and that this may have affected your stability under pressure? Her stomach clenched. The words were lifted straight from his file. She took a breath. Yes, she said quietly, I was bullied, I doubted myself, but I found something that gave me strength. And yesterday I proved that strength, not with perfect equipment, not with a captain's support. With sabotage pressing against me, I still stood here today. That isn't instability, that's resilience. The lawyer pressed harder. Isn't it true you assaulted Captain, broke his hand, in front of witnesses? Her voice sharpened. I defended my weapon from unlawful seizure. He reached for it during an official demonstration. Any soldier would have done the same. The medical report confirms his injuries are consistent with a defensive hold, not an attack. His eyes burned into her, fury simmering beneath his silence. The cross-examination ended. She stepped down from the stand, her legs weak but her chest rising with quiet pride. As she returned to her seat, she knew something had shifted. The truth was no longer locked inside her. It was out, echoing in the chamber, impossible to erase. The presiding officer adjourned the session. The full court-martial was scheduled, would stand trial. That night, as Frances lay in her bunk, she felt both lighter and heavier. Lighter for speaking, heavier for what was to come. The fight was not over, it was only beginning. But she had already made her choice. Silence was no longer an option. How do you measure the weight of truth when it's spoken aloud in a room built to deny it? The military courtroom smelled faintly of paper, sweat, and history. Its walls were lined with portraits of men who had shaped wars and commands, silent judges staring down on those who dared to disturb tradition. Beneath their gaze, the proceedings of Captain James' court-martial began. Frances sat rigid in her uniform at the witness bench. Her palms pressed flat against her knees to keep them from trembling. Her name had already rippled beyond the base, whispered across units, circulated in quiet reports, discussed in offices where decisions about the future of soldiers were made. She was no longer invisible, and she was no longer safe. Entered with his lawyers at his side, his casted hand now freed but still stiff. He wore his uniform with the stiffness of defiance, every ribbon and bar polished to gleaming perfection. His eyes swept the room, cold and sharp, pausing on Frances for the briefest of moments. His mouth curved in the faintest smirk, as though daring her to believe this trial would change anything. The presiding officer, a stern brigadier with decades of service etched into his face, gavelled the room to silence. "The matter before us," he intoned, "concerns deliberate sabotage of military equipment, abuse of command authority, and conduct unbecoming of an officer. Captain James, you stand accused. Do you understand the charges?" His voice was calm, calculated. "I do, and I reject them." The words rang with false confidence. The prosecution began with facts. Military engineers first, presenting diagrams of Frances's. They pointed to the scope distortion, the stress fractures in the bipod mounts, the dangerous tampering with the barrel. "This was no accident," the lead engineer said flatly. "This was sabotage designed to ensure failure or worse." The defense countered with rhetoric. These so-called modifications could easily be the result of routine wear and tear. To suggest deliberate sabotage is conjecture, not fact. The brigadier listened, expression unreadable. Then came the soldiers. Sarah Mitchell stepped forward, clutching a folder of documents, her voice trembling but resolute. She spoke of radios that always failed in her hands, equipment always assigned to her that never worked properly. She laid out logs that revealed deliberate mismatches between her requisitions and what provided. Followed, her voice stronger, though her hands gripped the edge of the stand. She spoke of training, opportunities, evaluations that mysteriously disappeared from her record. "Every time I asked why, Captain told me the same thing. Maybe this isn't your place." And then Sergeant Major Robert Clark took the stand. His words carried the heaviest weight. "I've served 30 years in uniform," he said, his voice rough with guilt. "I've seen men rise and fall. I've seen commanders protect and commanders destroy. And I'll admit this, I failed these soldiers. I saw tamper with equipment. I heard his words behind closed doors. I stayed silent because it was easier than standing against him, but I will not stay silent anymore." The courtroom hushed. Even the defense lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Piece by piece, the narrative built. The prosecution wove a picture not of isolated incidents, but of a pattern, systematic, deliberate, protected by silence. sat still through it all, his jaw tight, his eyes sharp, his smirk returning only when the defense rose. His lawyer tore into each witness with precision. Mitchell was inexperienced, was bitter over missed promotions. Clark was an aging soldier covering his own failures. And Frances was painted as the of a conspiracy. She is the one constant, the lawyer argued, packing before the panel. A young corporal with ambition beyond her station. She broke her commanding officer's hand in front of witnesses, a reckless assault. She turned a simple demonstration into a spectacle, and now she seeks to elevate herself by dragging down her superior. This is not justice. This is vengeance. The words sliced through the room. Frances's chest tightened. She felt eyes shift toward her, questioning, doubting. Smirk grew. But then General entered the chamber. Her boots echoed as she crossed the floor, her uniform immaculate, her presence commanding silence without a word. She took the stand, and when she spoke, the room stilled. "I have commanded soldiers across 4 continents," she said. "I have seen men and women broken in combat and rise again. I have seen courage in its form. And what I saw on that firing line was not vengeance. It was survival. Corporal Jones adapted to deliberate sabotage under the eyes of the world. That is not instability. That is strength. And I will state, for the record, that I recommended her for evaluation in our most elite units. Not because she is a woman, but because she is a soldier of rare resilience." Her words landed like hammer blows. The defense faltered, its mask cracked just slightly. But the trial was not yet over. The presiding officer turned to, "Captain, you may take the stand in your own defense." Rose, his uniform gleaming, his eyes burning. He walked with the swagger of a man who believed he could still talk his way free. He began smoothly, "And ladies, though fewer than there should be, for reasons we now see clearly, this is not about sabotage. This is about the lowering of standards, about the erosion of discipline, about the dangerous delusion that every soldier is equal in every way. I did not sabotage Corporal Jones's rifle. I challenged her. I tested her. And if she cannot withstand such pressure, she has no place in the units she covets. What you call sabotage, I call preparation. What you call cruelty, I call truth." His voice carried, persuasive, polished. Some in the room nodded despite themselves. He had built a career on this voice, this confidence, this ability to turn lies into weapons. But then, in a moment of arrogance, he went too far. He leaned forward, eyes fixed on the panel, and said, "If women cannot endure these trials, they do not belong here. And if I must be sacrificed to preserve the integrity of this military, then so be it." The silence that followed was heavier than any applause. His eyes narrowed, the brigadier's jaw clenched, and Frances, sitting on the bench, felt her heart hammer not with fear, but with the realization that he had condemned himself. For the first time, his arrogance had spoken the truth of his cruelty aloud. The court recessed. Judgment would come the next day. That night Frances walked alone along the edge of the training range. The valley stretched silent, the same valley where she had faced sabotage and silence and turned them into defiance. She breathed deeply, the cold air sharp in her lungs. Whatever the verdict, she knew one thing: his reign was already broken, his empire of silence shattered. And yet, in the quiet of that night, another truth settled heavy in her chest. Even if he fell, there were others like him, others waiting in shadows, others who would whisper the same poison. The fight was not over. But maybe, just maybe, it had finally begun. What sound does justice make when it finally arrives? The courtroom was silent when the panel returned. Officers sat stiff in their uniforms, eyes fixed forward, hands folded. Journalists lingered outside, their pens poised, their whispers muted. Soldiers filled the benches, their faces tense with expectation. Everyone waited for the words that would decide whether the system could still hold a man like accountable. Frances sat rigid, her pulse steady but heavy, her stomach tight with dread. She had told her truth. She had watched others do the same, and yet a part of her still expected silence to win. Silence always had. The presiding officer rose, papers in hand. His voice was calm, deliberate. On the charges of deliberate sabotage of military equipment, this court finds Captain James guilty. The word struck like a shot. His jaw tightened, but he didn't move. On the charges of abuse of command authority, this court finds Captain James guilty. A murmur rippled through the benches. On the charge of conduct unbecoming of an officer, this court finds Captain James guilty. The silence that followed was louder than any applause. Stood slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his face carved into a mask of false dignity. But Francis could see it, the flicker of rage in his eyes, the tremor in his jaw, the empire of silence he had built crumbling around him. The officer continued, "Captain is hereby stripped of rank, dishonorably discharged, and remanded into custody pending transfer to military prison." It was over. The gavel struck. The sound echoed through the chamber, final and absolute. But justice did not feel like triumph. Frances sat still, her breath shallow, her hands clasped tightly together. Around her, soldiers whispered, exchanged glances, shifted in their seats. Some smiled faintly. Others looked unsettled, unsure what to make of what they had witnessed. Was led away in cuffs, his shoulders still squared as if he believed he had not truly lost, as if he still thought his words would echo longer than hers. Frances watched him go, her chest heavy. She should have felt victorious, vindicated. She had stood against him, spoken the truth, survived his sabotage, and now he was gone. But instead she felt something else. Exhaustion. And beneath that, grief. Because was only one man. His fall did not erase the years of silence. It did not restore the careers of the women he had broken. It did not undo the whispers, the humiliation, the loneliness of knowing no one believed. Later, as the benches emptied and the courtroom doors closed, General approached. Her face was calm, her presence steady as always. "You did what few could," she said quietly. "You stood against him, you stood against silence." Frances lowered her eyes. "It doesn't feel like enough." Nodded slowly. "Because it is. Justice is never enough. It can't undo what's been done, but it can make space for something better." Her words lingered. That night Frances walked alone across the range where it had all begun. The valley stretched wide under a pale moon, the same valley where she had once pressed her cheek to a sabotaged rifle and refused to break. She stopped at the firing line, knelt in the dirt, and pressed her hand against the earth. The silence here was different now, not suffocating, not heavy, just quiet. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply. She remembered her grandfather's words again. "The world's quiet now, isn't it?" It was. But as she rose, she knew something else. The quiet would not last, was gone, but others would rise in his place. Men who believed as he did, men who hid behind silence. And when they came, she would be ready. The next morning, Frances was summoned to his office. A sealed envelope lay on the desk, her name typed across it in black letters. "Open," it said. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, orders. Temporary assignment, evaluation for special operations candidacy. Her chest tightened. For years she had fought to prove she belonged. For years had told her she was nothing. And now here it was, the opportunity that could change everything. She looked up at, her throat tight. "Why me?" His eyes softened. "Because you've already passed the test most never face. You endured sabotage, humiliation, isolation, and still found a way to rise. That isn't just marksmanship. That's resilience. And resilience is the only currency that matters in the field." Frances folded the paper carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and tucked it into her jacket. She felt the weight of it not as triumph, but as responsibility. A door had opened, but walking through it would mean carrying the memory of everyone who hadn't made it this far. She left the office with her shoulders straight, her stride steady. But inside, she carried a question she could not shake. If she walked through this new door, was she walking toward redemption, or into another silence waiting to test her? What does it mean to win, when winning costs so much? Frances asked herself that question as she stood at the edge of a new training ground months after the court-martial. The valley she once knew was far behind her. Now, she was in a different place, colder, harsher, filled with soldiers who didn't care about her past but studied her every move to see if she deserved to stand among them. Special Operations Evaluation, the Crucible. She was surrounded by men and women who had carved their names into the fabric of the military, each carrying scars, each built from endurance. They looked at her not as a victim, not as a witness in a courtroom, but as a candidate. For the first time, she was measured only by the weight of her skill. And yet shadow still lingered. Not in the faces around her, but in the questions inside her. Had she truly broken free of him, or was she still proving herself against the ghost of his voice? Every shot she fired, every mile she ran, every time her body ached and her mind screamed to quit, she heard his whisper, "You don't belong here." And every time she answered with silence, not the silence of fear, the silence of focus. Her first trial came on the range, different rifle, different wind, different ground, but the same clarity she had carried since that day in Yorkshire. One by one, targets fell. The instructors said nothing, only wrote notes. She lowered her weapon and breathed slowly, her cheek resting against the stock. The world was quiet. Later, she lay awake in her bunk, exhaustion wrapped around her like a second skin. Around her, candidates slept, some snoring softly, others twitching with dreams of failure. Frances stared at the ceiling and thought of the women who hadn't been given this chance. Sarah Mitchell. Names that would never be remembered in official reports, but that echoed in her memory as loudly as gunfire. This opportunity wasn't hers alone. It belonged to them too. The next evaluation pushed them into the wilderness. Days without rest, packs heavier than their bodies wanted to carry, rain slicing through uniforms, mud swallowing boots. Candidates dropped out, one by one. But Frances kept moving, not because she was stronger, but because she carried something heavier than the pack. She carried the weight of silence broken. Every night when her legs burned and her hands blistered, she remembered that courtroom. She remembered her own voice, steady despite fear. She remembered arrogance crumbling under truth. And she pressed forward. Weeks bled into months. At last, the evaluation ended. She stood in formation, rain dripping from her cap, mud caked across her uniform, her body trembling from exhaustion. An officer read the list of those who had passed. Her name was called. Jones. Her chest rose, her breath caught. She had done it. But even then, as the others clapped her shoulder, as the instructors nodded approval, she felt the truth settle inside her. This was not an ending. It was another beginning. Another path filled with silence, sacrifice, and trials no one outside would ever see. And she accepted it. Because this was who she was. Months later, back at the barracks, Frances received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was unfamiliar, careful. She opened it slowly. "You don't know me, but I wanted to thank you. I was one of the women Captain destroyed. He cost me my career. But when I heard what you did, when I heard you stood, when I heard you spoke, I felt something I thought I had lost. Hope. You may never know how many of us you carried that day. But I want you to know this. You weren't alone. You never were." Tears blurred the page. Her hands shook as she folded the letter, pressed it against her chest, and let herself feel the weight of it. For years she had fought believing she was alone. For years she had carried silence like a chain. And now she knew silence had been broken not just for her, but for others too. The next morning she walked once more to the range. She set up her rifle, adjusted the scope, pressed her cheek against the stock. She looked through the reticle at the distant targets and let her breath slow. The world narrowed, the noise faded. The world was quiet again. And she smiled just slightly because she finally understood. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts.